Michelle was beautiful. She basically attracted attention from anyone who came into her presence.
The kind-hearted spirit often draws comparison.
Michelle was everything she wanted to be.
For some, the fix for greener grass is to uproot it.
Here's a younger woman being thrown in your face.
She wanted her to just disappear.
But for others, the only solution is to burn it all down.
Her pain has festered for very, very, very long.
She had been following her for at least 6 months.
That lady was so insecure that jealousy came out of her.
She wanted exactly what they had, whatever she had to do.
That woman is a monster.
At around 3:30 a.m., neighbors of 27-year-old Michelle Bowie call 911 from outside her home.
It happened to be a duplex. There's an A side and a B side. The neighbors who called lived on the B side. They smelled a very, very strong smell of gasoline. They went outside and went to the apartment A, the other side of the duplex, and tried to find out if there was an issue. They knew that there was a 5-year-old boy that lived there with his mother. It just didn't sit right with the caller, so he decided to call 911.
Upon the fire department's arrival, they observed a young male standing in the front window, just standing there.
He was a small boy. The fire department made entry into the duplex, the A side, where they saw the boy. They removed him from the apartment.
They made their way through the house. When you walk straight back to the bathroom, that is where they found a deceased female.
She was laying face up in the bathtub. The victim that was found in the bathtub was Michelle Bowie.
With a homicide now on their hands, Norfolk detectives arrived to launch an investigation.
We finally entered the apartment at 6:45 in the morning. There was broken furniture, lamps. It wasn't like glaring that there was any robbery attempt. This looked more like that there was just a struggle, some kind of altercation that occurred.
The carpet had been removed in many, many areas.
There was blood in the living room. There was blood in the kitchen. And most obviously was the victim that was in the bathtub.
She had many, many lacerations around her neck. I believe it was 40 to 50 stab wounds, if not more.
There were deep cuts on her head and neck. The initial thought process was that whoever had done this, the intent was to possibly dismember Michelle. At some point, a decision was made to possibly burn down the dwelling. Gasoline was poured throughout the apartment.
But for some reason unknown, they decided to flee the scene before actually setting it on fire.
The brutality of the attack leaves no doubt in the investigator's mind that this was a personal attack. Someone wanted Michelle Bowie's silence. Michelle Bowie was born in 1984 as Michelle Wright, and she grew up in Norfolk, Virginia. She was one of 9 children. Michelle went to Tallwood High School, where she met Ronald Bowie.
The two quickly fell in love at a young age. Ronald and Michelle got married in the early 2000s.
I believe she was already married when she started working with Lockheed Martin, 18, 19, 20, very young. But she carried herself like an adult with her demeanor. She was a shipping and receiving clerk. She also assisted in doing inventories, picking material from locations, and she had an excellent knowledge of the computer systems. She was a rising star.
As Michelle found her footing at work, she and Ronald learned their family is growing.
They welcomed their lovely son, Xavier, in 2006.
He was a happy-go-lucky little boy. He loved his mom, and she loved him. They're very close. A couple of times she brought her young boy in. She was happy to show him around in her work areas and telling him that she loved her job and that it was all for him.
She was a person that everyone could rely on. Her personality is one that made everybody else load lighter.
She had a good sense of humor and made our day go by, with joy instead of having a sour face.
Even though her career was advancing, Michelle's marriage started to face difficulties. The couple separated in 2009. As a single mother, Michelle remained focused and resilient, determined to give her son the best life possible.
Michelle, as well as her son Xavier, ended up moving into a brand new apartment so that they could start life over.
After 2 years of life on her own, Michelle begins looking for more.
Michelle decided that she was ready to enter the dating world. At the age of 27, Michelle was beautiful, she was warm, she was attractive, and she basically attracted attention from anyone who came into her presence.
She was everything wrapped into one.
Unbeknownst to Michelle, her life is being watched with sinister intentions.
It's like a match, right? So the flame starts and it's a very slow burn.
I don't understand why Michelle didn't take it serious enough to call for help.
Norfolk police are trying to determine what would lead someone to viciously attack 27-year-old Michelle Bowie after finding her slain body inside her apartment bathtub.
We knew that the injuries on her face and neck contributed to her death. Forensics was able to lift fingerprints from the apartment. They collected cups from local fast food restaurants. We collected the trap from under the sink in the kitchen where the blood was, just in case that we could potentially get some DNA from that. We didn't know at that point what the actual weapon was that was used, but we did collect some knives from the apartment. There were 5 or 6 different cutting instruments, knives, utility knives, box cutters.
While the evidence is sent in for DNA testing, detectives turn their attention to witnesses still there at the scene.
An officer attempts to speak to Michelle's son to possibly understand what could have happened.
Unfortunately, he is 5 years old and Xavier is not able to give much information.
So the first detectives on the scene, they were taking him to be interviewed by a specialist. They have the training in interviewing children of crime victims.
Other investigators go out and start knocking on doors in the neighborhood to see if they heard anything, if they saw anything.
While police continue canvassing the neighborhood, a man arrives and approaches detectives outside the crime scene. He identifies himself as Everett Williams.
Everett Williams was Michelle's boyfriend. I told him that Michelle had been found murdered, and he broke down and became very emotional.
While Everett's emotion seems genuine, detectives are still cautious.
At this point in the investigation, we were treating everyone as if they could have been involved. He basically gave us a rundown of their relationship.
Everett shared that he had been staying at Michelle's apartment pretty much every day up until about a week ago.
According to Everett, he and Michelle had an argument recently and were taking some time apart. But he swears he would never do anything to hurt her.
They had still been talking. As a matter of fact, he talked to her the day before, around 2 p.m.
After that, they talked on the phone at 8 p.m., but Michelle got off the phone abruptly without any explanation.
She said she would call him back. He didn't necessarily find that strange. He just went about his business, and then he was expecting her to get back with him, and then he had fallen asleep. He woke up around 12:45 in the morning. He texted Michelle, and he got a response back saying that she would call him back. She never called him back. I asked him if he would provide a DNA sample, which he readily agreed to. He ended up providing consent for us to search the car that he showed up to the scene in, and he was subsequently released.
When they asked Everett if there was anyone that should be of some concern, he brought up her estranged husband, Ronald Bowie.
She was having a small custody dispute with her husband, Ronald, at the time about Xavier. Obviously, when there's a custody dispute and a homicide, that caught our attention.
While officers tried to make contact with Ronald, detectives meet with Michelle's neighbors and learn more about the suspicious circumstances that led to their 911 call.
The neighbors that were interviewed, they told us that around, I believe it was 8 or 9 o'clock the evening prior, Michelle had pulled up to the apartment, and she got out, and a black female had approached her, and there was a conversation between the Michelle and the black female that approached her. When the black female came up, Michelle said, "You scared me." And the female responded, "I'm not here to fight." And then they went inside the apartment.
One statement stood out specifically to investigators, and that's when a neighbor had said that she heard, "He's playing the both of us."
It makes you think that there's some kind of relationship issue going on, obviously. And then just from that point, you just have to build out and determine who is he, who is she.
Neighbors tell Norfolk police they saw a woman walk into Michelle Bowie's apartment just hours before the 27-year-old mother was found dead.
Around midnight, the neighbor said that they heard what appeared to be a struggle. They heard some scraping and banging on the wall, the common wall at the apartment.
At 3 a.m., neighbors were wakened by the smell of gasoline.
The smell of gas, it was so strong that it needed to be investigated.
That's when they also noticed that they could hear a noise coming from the rear, and they noticed the same black female that they had saw earlier.
The witnesses described the unknown female as a black female, approximately 5'3", 250 pounds, wearing a gray shirt, possibly blue shorts, and a bandana on her head.
They had asked the female that they saw if she had smelled gasoline, and she said that she did not. The neighbor indicated that something didn't seem right about it, and she ended up calling 911. As the fire trucks approached the address, the neighbor noticed that the female that they had been talking to got in the victim's vehicle and drove off.
Based on witnesses' statements, police believe that they are now looking for a woman in connection with Michelle's murder and immediately put out an APB on Michelle's missing vehicle.
So that goes out on a wide broadcast for police officers to watch for.
Given the brutality of the crime, police explore the possibility that Michelle was involved in a relationship scandal.
It was fairly evident that this was somebody who she knew and either was very close to her or really hated her.
Officers continue searching for Michelle's estranged husband, Ronald, while their son, Xavier, is held in protective custody. Meanwhile, word begins to spread about Michelle's tragic passing.
Our coworker, Mike, was in tears, and I couldn't understand why he was sobbing so bad. And once he gained his composure, he says, "You will not believe what I just heard, that Michelle Buie was murdered." Everybody was in shock, especially the family. You know, they were very devastated.
With officers in the area on high alert, detectives return to the station.
Around 11:30 that morning, Michelle's father showed up at the police department to talk to detectives. He said that a friend had called him and asked him if he'd seen the news.
He was completely shattered. He described Michelle as a warm soul and said she was not a troublemaker. Investigators do ask if he is aware of any other disputes or confrontations with anyone else, to which he says he's not aware of anything, not with any other woman, not with anyone at work.
He does bring up the ongoing custody dispute between her ex, Ronald.
Just like a love triangle, custody battles can stir deep emotions. Detectives may be looking for a woman, but Ronald isn't off the hook just yet.
About 3:15 that day, Ronald Buie arrived at the police operations center to speak with detectives. He came down there voluntarily and was interviewed. Ronald said he went to a roller skating party the night of the homicide. He had stayed with a friend throughout the night. Once he was told about Michelle, then he came to the police department. The last time Ronald saw Michelle was the Wednesday prior. He said it was at one of their court hearings.
He says that despite their custody issues, their relationship was actually pretty good. He said he would often call Michelle's phone to be able to speak with Xavier.
Ronald stated that he had no reason to hurt Michelle. They talked all the time. He said they were working through that custody issue.
At the same time, Ronald explains that he was doing his best to give Michelle space.
He knows where Michelle lives, but he hasn't been there since May 26. He had only been there to pick up their son, but he'd only been at the front door. He never went inside.
Ronald said that he was aware of Michelle's relationship with a man named Everett. If there were any red flags between Everett and Michelle, Ronald Buie did not mention any of them. He didn't mention much about him at all.
Instead, Ronald offers detectives a new name, Michelle's former coworker named Herschel.
At some point, they worked together, but at the time of this, they were working at two different places. Ronald didn't know exactly what their relationship status was, but he knew enough to know that he didn't like him.
Detectives learned that Herschel is married, and that marital status concerned Michelle's loved ones.
How do you see Herschel's role in all of this?
I think Herschel feels absolutely horrible because he never expected this to happen.
Norfolk police are interviewing the estranged husband of murder victim Michelle Bowie, who says a former coworker of hers named Herschel might warrant a closer look.
Ronald's alibi was confirmed and voluntarily submitted a DNA sample. We escorted him out of our office to the lobby, and Xavier was turned over to him.
So as Ronald leaves the interview, detectives have a new name to track down: Herschel.
By now, officers back at the scene have widened their search for evidence.
I know at some point, an officer looked into a dumpster.
Inside the dumpster, investigators found numerous trash bags, and in those trash bags were many pieces of carpeting that matched the carpet in Michelle's apartment.
There was fibers, there was some towels, there were several items that were collected from that dumpster.
Testing showed that there was a presence of blood in the items found in the dumpster.
That same day, police find Michelle's SUV less than a mile from the crime scene.
When Michelle's vehicle was recovered, there were several items of evidence inside. We found a section of carpet with what appeared to be bloodstains on it.
Then, at 4 p.m., detectives get a game-changing call.
We got a phone call from Desiree Henderson. She said she was Charlene Mitchell's sister. Charlene was married to Herschel, the person we were looking for.
It was early in the morning, and she called, and I was kind of confused because she usually doesn't call in the morning. So I was taken aback that she called. But she asked a really strange question. Just asked if I had saw the news. I'm like, no, I haven't seen the news. What's on the news? Then she asked me if there was anything in the news about a female in Norfolk, and was there any news related to a bathtub incident? And then she said that she needed help. She started talking about what happened. She's like, I just wanted to talk to her. And she said, and things just got out of control. It was so surreal. I could not believe. I think I was in shock. I didn't know what to say. And then she asked him questions about, should she, talk to the police? Yeah, you absolutely should, because I'm absolutely gonna call them when we hang up. Whatever happened, give it to them, not me. I don't want to be involved.
Just before 5 p.m., I was notified that Charlene and Herschel Mitchell were in the lobby of the Police Operations Center.
Charlene came in and said she wants to turn herself in for the assault that happened to Michelle. They brought her back, her and Herschel, back to the interview rooms, separate interview rooms.
I noticed that Charlene had some bandages on her left hand and lower arm, and there was visible blood on her clothing.
Charlene's emotions were calm and cold. That's the easiest way to describe it. No emotions.
We tried to gather some identifying information just for the initial report and intake information. She wouldn't provide anything. She slid her driver's license across the desk and said, I need my lawyer. And that was it.
Detectives turned their attention to Herschel.
He provided all of his pedigree information, where he worked, kids, his wife, date of birth, social security number, all that information. And then just from that point, you just have to build out and determine who is he, who is she.
Born in 1973, Charlene Mitchell grew up in a tight-knit and loving family.
There are 6 of us. Charlene is the oldest, and I have 4 brothers and myself. Growing up, Charlene was always the one who wanted to be in charge of everybody. Religion was very, very important to us growing up.
Charlene met her future husband, Herschel, when she was still a teenager.
Their relationship was very interesting because once she met him, it was all about him. Everything was about Herschel. She was just in love with him. And you could tell that Herschel was also in love with my sister as well. He loved her. He took very good care of her.
At 17, Charlene had her very first child.
I remember they was talking to my dad about her getting married and not being old enough to get married, and he had to do something with some paperwork.
They came back and they were like, we're married. And so we're like, oh, congratulations, we have another brother.
Oh, I loved Herschel. His personality was awesome, man. Like, he has always been a good dad. He worked hard. He was like the ultimate. I really looked up to him.
Over the years, Charlene and Herschel's family continued to grow.
They had 2 kids, but they always made time for each other. They would go, just like any other couple, they would go to the movies, they would go to friends' parties, they would have their own events at their house because she liked to cook.
I thought that Charlene's and Herschel's relationship was forever. That's how I would describe it, like my mom and dad. And I thought that their relationship was sacred. It was a positive thing.
How would you describe Charlene and Herschel's relationship around that August?
Herschel wasn't doing what she wanted, and I think that her thinking about losing him, that caused her just to lose her mind.
When detectives shift their line of questioning to what happened to Michelle Bowie, they hit a wall.
As soon as we started asking him questions about the incident, he said, "Get me a lawyer."
Norfolk police know that 38-year-old Charlene Mitchell is connected to the murder of Michelle Bowie, but they're still trying to determine why, after both Charlene and her husband, Herschel, have refused to cooperate any further.
Part of the process is also getting search warrants for DNA from individuals. So until that takes place, then they're still not free to leave, but they're not under arrest.
Meanwhile, police attempt to find out all they can about the couple's connection to Michelle.
We heard Michelle and Herschel worked together previously, and that's where they first met each other.
We went out on the 23rd of August to her job in Chesapeake and spoke with her supervisor.
Speaking with the individual supervisors and co-workers of Michelle, it was found out that Charlene would actually show up at Michelle's work and Herschel's work.
Basically, she wanted to confront Michelle about the affair that Herschel and Michelle were supposedly having. But based on all of the information we got, there was no relationship romantically with Herschel. They were friends.
That was not like Michelle, to where she would go out there and do something like extramarital affair.
Charlene didn't get the chance to talk to Michelle. Michelle wouldn't go out there. This incident that Michelle's supervisor talked about was in September of 2010. So that was almost a year before this murder took place in August of 2011.
When police follow up with Michelle's family, they say this wasn't an isolated incident. It was only the beginning.
When speaking with Michelle's family, they stated that Herschel's wife would basically stalk Michelle, go to her work, go to the gym, go to parks.
We were told that Charlene had pretended to be a Jehovah's Witness and gone to Michelle's house to try and make contact with her. Charlene had been following her for at least 6 months. Several family members and friends that they were just friends. I'm not 100% sure that Michelle took it seriously because there wasn't a relationship other than friendship as far as she was concerned.
Michelle's family could see that it was platonic, but Charlene could not. Why? Because there was an emotional disconnect between Charlene and her husband that she feared he found somewhere else.
Michelle's sister, she stated that she had talked to Michelle on August 20th, the day before the homicide occurred. And she stated that she was at the Livermore Park with Xavier and Herschel.
She told her sister that she was exercising in the park with Xavier and Herschel. And her sister said, "You'll really be exercising if Charlene finds you." She knew that if they were caught together, and Charlene was the one that caught him, that there would be some kind of incident.
When detectives sit down with Charlene's sister, Desiree, she provides more context to Charlene's recent unraveling.
Charlene and Herschel met when she was really young, and he was young as well. So as the kids started growing older, they started to perhaps want different things. Charlene just mentioned that, Herschel had talked about possibly, waiting for the kids to get older and kind of see where they were at that point, if they wanted to perhaps separate. She wanted to maintain her marriage, because when you get married, you think that you're going to be married forever, till death do us part. In 2010, she did mention that she thought that Herschel might be seeing someone else. She had seen some phone numbers in his phone, which made her question who he was talking to, and he wasn't coming home like his normal time. Sometimes he would be out later.
It took a big toll on her, yeah. You was with this man like before you was even an adult. And I could only imagine how the human mind could be if you thought someone's coming to take that person away from you.
We know that Herschel and Charlene was having some challenges, and Herschel was looking for a safety support that Michelle easily became. So in that moment, could this be considered an emotional affair? Maybe.
When Herschel started talking about leaving, I think that's when the fire started, and it kept burning up until the moment she thought that Herschel may have had interest in Michelle.
She definitely wanted them to stay together. Whatever she had to do.
After hours of interviews into the lives of Charlene Mitchell and her husband Herschel, Norfolk police are beginning to get a good idea of what led to the murder of 27-year-old Michelle Bowie.
When DNA testing is completed, police recover DNA consistent with Charlene's DNA across the apartment.
We ended up charging Charlene with second-degree murder and grand larceny for taking Michelle's vehicle from the scene. We had nothing to show that Herschel was at Michelle's house the night of the homicide, and Herschel was eventually released.
A child victim specialist also speaks to the victim's 5-year-old son, Xavier Bowie. Through these interviews, the true extent of this horrific tragedy comes to light.
He said that Charlene hurt Mommy. He said that she made Mommy bleed and Mommy laid on the floor. Xavier told us Charlene told Michelle to stop screaming and said that she was going to die. He said there was a mess in the house and also made a throwing motion when talking about the gas stink.
For someone that was 5, he had an extraordinary memory of the incident. Making the throwing motion, which would end up being the gasoline in the house. Telling Mommy to stop, kind of stop fighting.
The boy knew that lady's name. That is very heartbreaking, to know that a little boy identified his mother's killer.
Xavier's account gives police all they need to put together a compelling timeline of the crime that took place on August 21st, 2011.
It seems pretty clear to us that the motive for the homicide was jealousy. Michelle was in this perceived relationship with Herschel, and Charlene didn't like it.
Michelle was 10 years younger. She was beautiful, successful, and then on top of that, her husband's telling her he's not happy, he want out. So she definitely felt threatened.
She probably wanted her to just disappear out of Herschel's world.
She wanted to take Michelle's place to reclaim the life she thought was leaping away.
Based on Charlene's past actions, she followed either Herschel or Michelle, or both, to Larimore Park.
That lady was so insecure that just by seeing them exercising together, that she had jealousy that came out of her.
Then that led to the later confrontation.
I don't know if she went over there with the intention of, murder on her mind, but shit, some kind of activity was going down.
Detectives suspect the knife came from inside Michelle's home, and the accelerant from a gas can Charlene likely found in a backyard shed.
I don't really have much doubt in my mind that she would have burned that place down with the residents in apartment B and Xavier in there as well.
I think she got interrupted. She may have heard the fire trucks or whatever, and she just got away. Her mind thinking was, let me just get out of here.
We were fully prepared to go to trial on this case based on the prosecutor's conversation with the family and taking Xavier into account.
They weighed the positives and negatives of having to put Xavier on the stand. And it was determined that Charlene would accept a second-degree murder charge and a larceny charge and be sentenced to 40 years.
I was really upset with my sister. I was really upset with her. What she did was awful. It was awful. And I didn't want people to look at me and think, oh, that's her sister, she's from that family. Her family's not like that. She didn't grow up like that.
I wish you were able to support each other during that time.
A few months after she had went to jail, I wrote her a letter, and I just told her that I was upset that I have to spend my adult years without her, and I didn't have a choice. She changed the dynamics of our whole family in one night, and we'll never be able to change it back.
As far as I know, there's never been any remorse shown by Charlene Mitchell that I know of.
That woman is a monster, and not only killed Michelle, but did it right there in the presence of that little boy.
Michelle was, from everything we've gathered, wasn't doing anything wrong. She was an innocent victim. She was hanging out with a friend, and because of somebody else's skewed view of it, she ended up dead.
The family lost a loving sister, a loving daughter. Michelle's loss was hard for us at the work site because we missed her laughter, we missed her smiles. You know, we felt that love and joy and everything just like an actual family member.
On a cold October night in 1974, inside one of the most respected universities in America, a young woman walked into a place of worship and never walked out alive. Her name was Arliss K. Perry. She was only 19 years old. A newlywed, a college student, a young woman with a future that seemed wide open. But before sunrise, the quiet halls of Stanford University would become the scene of one of the most haunting murder investigations in California history. A crime so brutal, a mystery so deep, a case so frozen in time that generations would pass before a single piece of evidence would finally speak. For nearly 4 decades, the question remained unanswered. Who killed Arliss Perry? And why did her murder remain hidden behind a wall of silence for 40 years? The answer would eventually come from something invisible to the human eye, a trace left behind in the darkness, a microscopic piece of evidence that had been waiting decades to reveal the truth. But on the night she disappeared, nobody knew they were standing at the beginning of one of the most disturbing cold cases America had ever seen. October 12, 1974. Stanford University. Palo Alto, California. The campus was peaceful. The kind of place where students walked beneath tall trees, where libraries stayed open late into the night, where dreams of science, technology, and discovery filled the air. It was a place associated with intelligence and opportunity, a place where people believed they were safe. But hidden inside that peaceful environment was a crime scene that would shock the entire nation. Arliss Perry had arrived at Stanford with her husband, Bruce Perry. The couple had been married only a few weeks earlier. They were young. They were building a life together. Like many college students, they were trying to balance responsibilities, relationships, and the uncertainty of the future. On that evening, Arliss and Bruce spent time together before separating briefly. According to investigators, Arliss wanted to visit the Stanford Memorial Church. The church was one of the most recognizable landmarks on campus. A beautiful building, a historic place, a location where students often went for quiet reflection. That night, Arliss entered the church, but she never returned. At first, there was no immediate alarm. There was no dramatic warning, no phone call, no desperate message. Just a young woman who seemed to disappear into the darkness of a campus that appeared completely ordinary. Hours passed. Then concern began to grow. Her husband reported her missing. Search efforts began. Students and campus officials looked through the surrounding areas. They searched pathways. They checked buildings. They hoped they would find a simple explanation. Maybe Arliss had stayed somewhere overnight. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe she would return. But as the hours continued, the possibility became darker. Something had happened. Something terrible. Early the next morning, October 13th, a university security officer entered Stanford Memorial Church. Inside, the peaceful atmosphere was gone. The officer discovered a horrifying scene. Arliss Perry was found dead near the altar. The young woman who had entered the church the previous night as a student was now at the center of a murder investigation. The scene shocked everyone who heard about it. The location itself made the crime even more disturbing. A church, a place associated with comfort, faith, and protection. now transformed into the setting of an unsolved killing. Investigators immediately began examining every detail. The crime scene revealed signs of violence. The brutality suggested that this was not a random accident. Someone had entered that sacred space with a deadly purpose. Someone had taken Arliss Perry's life, and that person had disappeared. The first hours of an investigation are often the most important. Every footprint matters. Every witness matters. Every unexplained movement matters. But this case immediately presented a terrifying challenge. There were no clear answers, no obvious suspect, no confession, no immediate breakthrough. Only questions. Who had seen Arliss that night? Who knew she would be inside the church? Was the killer a stranger who happened upon her? Or was the killer someone who already knew her? The investigation quickly expanded beyond the church. Detectives interviewed students. They questioned campus employees. They searched for anyone who had noticed unusual activity. The Stanford community was suddenly living with fear. A murderer had walked onto their campus, a place many believed was one of the safest environments in the country. The news spread quickly. The murder of a young college student inside a university church became a national story. Headlines captured the horror. A student killed. A campus shaken. A killer unknown. The pressure on investigators was enormous. Every day without an arrest created more uncertainty. The public wanted answers. Arliss Perry's family wanted justice. Her husband wanted to know who had taken away the person he loved. But the investigation soon entered dangerous territory. The deeper detectives looked, the more complicated the case became. There were theories. There were rumors. There were possible suspects. But nothing solid enough to end the nightmare. One of the earliest challenges was understanding Arliss herself. Who was she? What kind of person was she? Friends describe her as intelligent, gentle, and deeply religious. She had hopes and plans. She was not someone who lived a dangerous lifestyle. She was not someone investigators could easily connect to violence. That made the crime even more confusing. Why would anyone want to hurt her? Why inside the church? Why that night? The answers remained hidden. As months passed, the initial wave of attention began to fade. The cameras left. The headlines disappeared. But for Arliss Perry's loved ones, the pain never faded. A murder investigation does not end when the news cycle moves on. For families, time does not erase unanswered questions. It only adds more years of waiting. And for detectives, the case became a haunting reminder of a simple truth. Some killers do not disappear because they are innocent. Sometimes they disappear because they are patient. The years move forward. 1975 became 1976. The world changed. Technology advanced. New crimes captured public attention. But inside the files of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, the name Arliss Perry remained. A young woman, a church, a brutal murder, and a killer who had escaped justice. The investigation continued quietly. Detectives reviewed evidence. They followed leads. They considered possible suspects. But the case slowly became what investigators feared most. A cold case. A file filled with photographs, reports, interviews, and unanswered questions. A mystery trapped in time. Yet, somewhere inside that evidence was something nobody could fully understand in 1974. Something so small it could not be seen. Something that would not reveal its importance until decades later. DNA technology would change criminal investigations forever. But when Arliss Perry was murdered, that technology did not exist. The killer had left behind evidence. But science was not ready to use it. And for nearly 40 years, the truth remained locked away. The world moved on. The Stanford campus continued to grow. New students arrived every year. Most never knew that behind the peaceful walls of Memorial Church was a crime that had remained unsolved for generations. But some people never forgot. They remembered Arliss. They remembered the fear. They remembered the question that had haunted the community since that October night. Who killed her? And after 4 decades of silence, investigators would finally return to the evidence. They would reopen old wounds. They would examine forgotten clues. And they would discover that the answer had been waiting all along, hidden in the smallest trace left behind at the scene of a crime that shocked America. A trace that would eventually point directly toward the person who had escaped suspicion for decades. The clock had been frozen, but it had never stopped. For years, the murder of Arliss Perry remained one of Stanford University's darkest secrets. The campus continued to function. Students walked through the same pathways. Professors entered the same buildings. Visitors admired the beauty of Stanford Memorial Church, unaware that decades earlier, behind those same walls, a young woman's life had ended in a crime that investigators could not solve. But beneath the surface, the case never truly disappeared. The evidence remained. The questions remained. And somewhere, the person responsible continued living with a secret that had survived for decades. In the immediate aftermath of Arliss Perry's murder, investigators faced a case filled with contradictions. The crime scene was shocking, but the identity of the killer remained unclear. There were no easy answers, no obvious motive, no clear connection between Arliss and the person who attacked her. Detectives knew one thing with certainty. The killer had spent time inside the church. The killer had taken control of the situation. And the killer had left behind clues. But those clues would take decades before they could finally be understood. At the beginning of the investigation, authorities focused heavily on the people closest to the crime scene. That meant students, campus employees, security personnel, anyone who had access to Stanford Memorial Church. The question investigators kept returning to was simple but critical. Who could have entered that building unnoticed on the night Arliss died? The church was not an isolated location. It was part of a busy university environment. People came and went. There were students studying late, workers moving across campus, security officers making rounds. Yet somehow, a murderer had entered the building, committed a violent crime, and vanished. The investigation became a race against time. Detectives interviewed witnesses who remembered seeing Arliss that evening. They collected statements from people who had been near the church. They searched for anyone who might have noticed suspicious behavior. But memories can be unreliable. A person seen walking across campus could become a possible suspect. A simple coincidence could appear meaningful. And every rumor created another path investigators had to examine. One early theory suggested that the killer may have been someone who knew the church well. Someone comfortable enough to move through the building. Someone who understood the quiet patterns of the campus. That possibility changed the atmosphere at Stanford. The idea that the killer could be among the people walking through campus every day created a sense of unease. Students began looking differently at strangers. Employees questioned familiar faces. The feeling of security had been damaged. But despite the fear, investigators struggled to find the missing piece. The person who could connect all the evidence together. The case soon became a complicated puzzle. There were potential suspects. There were interviews. There were theories. But there was no arrest. And without a suspect, the investigation slowly began to lose momentum. Then came another problem. Time. Time is one of the greatest enemies in any murder investigation. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. People forget small details. Physical evidence becomes harder to analyze. Technology changes. Priorities shift. And as the years pass, the murder of Arliss Perry moved further into the category that every investigator fears. An unsolved case, a cold case. But for the Perry family, there was nothing cold about it. The pain remained fresh. The loss remained permanent. Arliss was not a headline. She was not just a name in an investigation file. She was a daughter, a wife, a young woman whose future had been stolen. Her family waited for answers that never came. They wanted to know who had done this. They wanted to know why. Most importantly, they wanted justice. But the years continued. The 1970s ended. The 1980s arrived. The world entered a new era. Computers became more common. Forensic science developed. Criminal investigations began changing. And slowly, a new tool began transforming the way police solved murders. DNA analysis. In 1974, DNA evidence was still unknown in criminal investigations. The science that would later identify criminals around the world simply did not exist. Investigators could collect biological evidence. They could preserve it. They could store it. But they could not yet unlock the identity hidden inside. That meant evidence from Arliss Perry's murder sat silently for years, waiting. Decades later, detectives would look back at old cases with new technology. Cases once considered impossible began reopening. Cold cases that had remained frozen started moving again. And Arliss Perry's murder was one of them. But before science could provide answers, investigators still had to understand the past. They had to return to the original investigation. They had to examine every person connected to the case, every statement, every report, every decision made in the early days. Because sometimes the answer to a mystery is not found in a new discovery. Sometimes it is hidden inside something investigators saw decades earlier but could not interpret. One name repeatedly appeared throughout the history of the case. A person who had been close to the crime scene. A person whose connection to Stanford placed him near the investigation from the beginning. His name was Stephen Crawford. At the time of the murder, Crawford was a 20-year-old Stanford student working as a campus security officer. He was one of the people responsible for protecting the university. He was someone who knew the campus. Someone familiar with its buildings. Someone who understood the routines of the place. And on the morning Arliss Perry's body was discovered, Crawford was among the first people connected to the official response. His role made him a person investigators had to examine. But for decades, the case remained unresolved. The suspicion surrounding many individuals never developed into proof. And Crawford, like many others connected to the investigation, remained outside the reach of prosecution. Years passed. Decades passed. The name Arliss Perry became part of Stanford's history. But not in the way anyone wanted. Her murder became a symbol of unanswered questions. A reminder that some cases survive because the truth is buried deeper than anyone expects. By the 2010s, advances in forensic science were changing old investigations. Police departments across America were reopening cold cases. Evidence once considered useless was being tested again. DNA databases were connecting crimes separated by years and sometimes decades. Investigators began asking a new question. What if the evidence from 1974 could finally speak? What if the killer had left behind the one thing that could identify him? The case that had been silent for nearly 40 years was about to enter a new chapter. Detectives returned to the evidence collected decades earlier. They examined materials that had been stored since the night Arliss Perry was found. Technology had changed. The science had changed. And suddenly, the smallest details became the most important. A sample, a trace, a genetic signature. The possibility of an answer was no longer impossible. But solving a cold case is not just about technology. It is about connecting the past with the present. It requires investigators to look at old facts with new eyes. And as they began rebuilding the timeline of October 12, 1974, one disturbing reality started to emerge. The person responsible for Arliss Perry's death may not have been a stranger hiding in the shadows. The killer may have been someone who was already there, someone who knew the campus, someone who understood how to move unnoticed, someone who had spent nearly 40 years believing the truth would never catch up. But time had changed. Science had advanced, and the evidence that once seemed meaningless was preparing to reveal a name that would shock those who had followed the case for decades, a name connected to the very place where Arliss Perry's final moments unfolded. The investigation that had gone silent for generations was beginning to speak again, and this time, the truth would not stay buried. For nearly 4 decades, the murder of Arliss Perry existed in the space between memory and mystery. A crime everyone remembered. A case nobody could solve. The photographs had aged. The reports had yellowed. The names of investigators had changed. But one question remained exactly the same as it was on the morning of October 13, 1974. Who killed Arliss Perry inside Stanford Memorial Church? By the early 2010s, cold case investigators had learned that time did not always destroy evidence. Sometimes time preserved it. A fingerprint that could not be matched in the 1970s could become valuable decades later. A biological sample once considered impossible to analyze could become the key to identifying a killer. And the Arliss Perry investigation was about to experience the kind of breakthrough that detectives dream about but rarely see. A forgotten clue was waiting. But before the science could reveal the truth, investigators had to revisit the darkness of that night. They had to reconstruct the final hours of a young woman whose life ended in one of the most disturbing locations imaginable. October 12, 1974. The evening began like any other night on the Stanford campus. Students moved between dormitories. Libraries remained active. The university carried on with its normal rhythm. Nobody knew that before the night ended, a murder would permanently change the history of the campus. Arliss Perry had no reason to believe she was in danger. She was a young woman beginning a new chapter of her life. She had recently married Bruce Perry. She was adjusting to adulthood. She was studying. She was planning for the future. Those ordinary dreams made what happened even more difficult to understand. There was no explanation, no warning, no obvious reason why someone would target her. And that uncertainty became one of the most painful parts of the case. Investigators were not only searching for a killer, they were searching for a motive. Why Arliss? Why inside the church? Why that specific night? Those questions followed the investigation for decades. The crime scene itself created a disturbing picture. The church was supposed to represent peace, a place where people prayed, a place where students could find quiet moments away from the pressure of university life. But inside that building, investigators found evidence of violence. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A sacred place had become the scene of a brutal crime. The symbolism made the murder even more shocking. News organizations across the country followed the investigation. The Stanford name brought national attention. People were fascinated and horrified that such a crime could happen at a prestigious university. The public demanded answers. But the investigation moved slowly. One reason was the absence of a clear suspect. In many murder cases, investigators begin with a connection, a relationship, a financial motive, a personal conflict. But Arliss Perry's case lacked that obvious path. Detectives had to examine possibilities from every direction. Was it someone she knew? Was it someone watching her? Was it someone who happened to encounter her? Each possibility created more questions, and each unanswered question pushed the case deeper into uncertainty. Over the years, several individuals came under attention. Some were questioned. Some were investigated. Some were discussed publicly. But suspicion alone was never enough. A murder case requires evidence, a connection between a person and a crime, a reason that can survive inside a courtroom. And for decades, that connection remained missing. Then there was the problem of the timeline. The hours before Arliss entered the church became one of the most important parts of the investigation. Detectives wanted to know who was near the area, who saw her, who may have followed her, who had the opportunity to commit the crime. Every minute mattered. Every movement mattered. But after so many years, reconstructing those moments became extremely difficult. Witnesses remembered fragments. Details became uncertain. The passage of time created gaps. And those gaps became places where the truth could hide. Yet one fact remained impossible to ignore. The killer had left evidence behind. Evidence that investigators had collected. Evidence that had survived. Evidence that modern science could finally examine. By the beginning of the 21st century, DNA technology had transformed criminal investigations. Cases once considered permanently unsolvable were reopening. Murderers who had escaped justice for decades were being identified. Families who had waited years were finally receiving answers. The question became, could the same thing happen for Arliss Perry? Could science succeed where traditional investigation had failed? Detectives began carefully reviewing the stored evidence. The process was slow and precise. Cold case investigations are not dramatic like television. They are built on patience. Thousands of pages, old photographs, archived interviews, evidence boxes untouched for years. Every detail must be reconsidered. Every assumption must be questioned. Because after decades, the truth may be hidden in the one place nobody expected. As investigators looked deeper, attention once again turned toward people who had been connected to Stanford at the time of the murder. And one person continued to stand out: Stephen Crawford. In 1974, Crawford was not just another student. He was part of the campus security system, a person whose job involved watching over the university, a person who knew the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities. His position placed him in a unique relationship with the crime scene. But for decades, suspicion did not become prosecution. There was no public arrest, no trial, no confession. The case remained open. Crawford continued living his life while the investigation remained unresolved. And for many years, the question surrounding him was only one of many unanswered questions. But as investigators revisited the case, they began examining old information to the lens of modern forensic science. The world had changed since 1974. DNA databases had expanded. Testing methods had improved. Evidence that once provided only basic information could now reveal a complete genetic profile. And then came the moment every cold case detective hopes for: a possible match, a connection between the evidence collected decades earlier and a person who had been associated with the investigation from the very beginning. The past was reaching into the present. The crime scene from 1974 was speaking again. But solving a 40-year-old murder was not only about identifying DNA. Investigators needed to understand the full story. They needed to know who had the opportunity, who had access, who had been near Arliss Perry during her final hours. They needed to build a case strong enough to answer the question that had haunted Stanford for generations. Not just who, but how and why. The investigation entered a new and intense phase. Detectives began looking at Stephen Crawford more closely. They examined his history, his connection to Stanford, his statements, his actions after the murder. Every detail that had once seemed insignificant now carried new importance. For years, the killer had hidden behind the passage of time. But time had created something unexpected. It had given science the ability to catch up. The same decades that allowed the mystery to grow were also decades that allowed forensic technology to evolve. And slowly, the impossible began to look possible. The Arliss Perry case was no longer just an old file. It was becoming an active investigation again. A forgotten murder was returning to the headlines. A community that had lived with uncertainty for 40 years was preparing to hear answers. But those answers would come with a shocking revelation. Because the person investigators were now focusing on was not a stranger from outside the university. The trail appeared to lead back to someone who had been there. Someone who had been part of the campus. Someone who had watched the investigation unfold from close range. And as detectives moved closer to the truth, one terrifying question emerged. Had the person responsible for Arliss Perry's murder been hiding in plain sight all along? For nearly 40 years, the answer had remained buried. Now, the evidence was finally beginning to reveal what happened inside Stanford Memorial Church. And once that truth emerged, nothing about the case would ever look the same again. For decades, the murder of Arliss Perry remained a painful mystery written into the history of Stanford University. The campus continued to grow. Buildings changed. Students came and went. Entire generations passed through the university without knowing the full weight of what had happened inside Stanford Memorial Church on that October night in 1974. But for investigators, the case never truly disappeared. It existed inside boxes of evidence. Inside archive reports. Inside memories of detectives who had spent years searching for a single answer. The murder of Arliss Perry had become more than a cold case. It had become a symbol of unfinished justice. And then, after nearly 40 years, a new era of forensic investigation began opening doors that had been locked for decades. The evidence collected in 1974 was no longer silent. Science had changed. Technology had changed. And suddenly, a case that once seemed frozen forever began moving again. The breakthrough came from DNA, a scientific tool that did not exist when Arliss Perry was killed. A tool that would eventually transform the investigation from a mystery into a confrontation with the past. But DNA alone does not solve a murder. It creates a path, a connection, a question that investigators must answer. And in the Arliss Perry case, that question led them back to a name that had existed around the investigation from the very beginning. Stephen Crawford. In 1974, Crawford was a Stanford University student. But he was not simply another face among thousands on campus. He worked as a campus security officer. He had access. He had knowledge of the university grounds. He understood the environment. He knew the buildings. He knew the routines. And after the discovery of Arliss Perry's body, his position placed him close to the unfolding investigation. For years, Crawford remained a figure of interest because of that connection. But interest was not evidence. Suspicion was not proof. And without a forensic link, the case remained unsolved. That changed when investigators returned to the evidence with modern DNA testing methods. The sample collected decades earlier provided something detectives had never possessed before: a scientific connection, a genetic profile, a possible bridge between the crime scene and a person. The investigation that had stalled for generations suddenly had direction. But detectives knew that one piece of evidence would not be enough. They needed to understand the entire picture. They needed to revisit Crawford's relationship with the campus, his movements, his behavior, his connection to the night Arliss disappeared. Every detail mattered, because cold cases are built differently from fresh investigations. There is no rush of immediate information, no active crime scene, no witnesses standing nearby waiting to speak. Instead, investigators must rebuild the past. They must reconstruct moments that happened decades earlier. and every piece must fit. The timeline became one of the most important elements. What happened after Arliss entered Stanford Memorial Church? Who was nearby? Who had the ability to enter? Who had knowledge of the location? The answers were hidden inside decades-old records. Investigators reviewed previous interviews. They examined old statements. They compared information that had been collected in 1974 with what modern evidence was revealing. And slowly, the picture became clearer. The person responsible had not been caught because the investigation failed. The person responsible had avoided justice because the technology needed to expose him had not yet existed. The killer had escaped into time. But time was running out. As the investigation moved forward, authorities focused more attention on Crawford. The question was no longer only whether he had been connected to the crime scene. The question became whether the evidence could finally prove that connection. For the Perry family, this renewed investigation brought a mixture of emotions. After decades of waiting, there was finally hope, but there was also pain. Every cold case revival forces families to reopen wounds that never completely healed. The memories return. The questions return. The loss returns. For Arliss Perry's loved ones, the possibility of an answer came nearly 4 decades after they first asked the world to listen. The case had survived because people refused to forget. Investigators refused to stop searching. And science finally provided the opportunity to uncover what had been hidden. The story of Arliss Perry's murder was about to change. But before the final chapter could be written, investigators needed one more thing. They needed confirmation. They needed to know whether the DNA evidence truly connected Crawford to the crime. And they needed to understand what would happen when they confronted a man who had spent most of his life beyond suspicion. The investigation became increasingly intense. Detectives watched. They analyzed. They prepared. Because cold case arrests often create a unique challenge. The suspect is no longer the person they were decades earlier. Time changes people. A young man in 1974 becomes an older man decades later. But the crime remains exactly where it happened. Frozen. Waiting. The authorities now had a decision to make. How do you approach someone who has lived for 40 years believing the past would never return? How do you confront a person who may have carried a secret through an entire lifetime? The answer would come through careful investigation. Not through emotion. Not through assumptions. Through evidence. The same evidence that had been sitting quietly since the night Arliss Perry died. The same evidence that modern science had finally unlocked. As detectives continued building the case, the Stanford community began remembering the tragedy once again. The murder that had shocked the university decades earlier returned to public attention. People who had never forgotten Arliss began following the developments. New generations learned the story. The name that had once appeared only in old newspaper archives was suddenly back in headlines. A young woman. A university church. A 40-year-old mystery. And now, a possible answer. But even with the DNA breakthrough, one major question remained. Would justice finally arrive? Because solving a cold case is not only about identifying a suspect. It is about proving what happened. It is about giving a voice to someone who can no longer speak. And it is about confronting the reality that a person may have lived for decades after committing an unimaginable crime. In the years after Arliss Perry's murder, many believed the case might never be solved. They believed the truth had disappeared. But investigators discovered something important. The truth does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. It waits inside evidence. It waits inside forgotten records. It waits for the right moment. And in the Arliss Perry case, that moment had finally arrived. The investigation was no longer searching in the dark. It had a direction. It had a suspect. And it had the one thing that had been missing since 1974. A connection. The decades of silence were beginning to break. The frozen file was opening. And the man who had escaped the shadow of suspicion for nearly 40 years was about to face the evidence that had survived all along. The question that haunted Stanford for generations was finally moving toward an answer. Who killed Arliss Perry? The answer was closer than anyone imagined. 40 years frozen in time, one DNA sample that turned the entire case upside down. The murder of Arliss Perry. Part 6. For nearly 40 years, the murder of Arliss Perry remained one of California's most haunting unanswered questions. The case had survived through changing generations. The investigators who first walked into Stanford Memorial Church in 1974 had long since moved on. The newspapers that covered the shocking crime had become historical records. The students who remembered the fear that spread across campus had grown older. But the mystery remained exactly where it had begun, inside a quiet church, on a dark October night, with a young woman whose life ended far too soon, and a killer who vanished into the passage of time. But in 2018, the past finally caught up. The breakthrough that investigators had spent decades waiting for was no longer a possibility. It was real. The DNA evidence collected from the original crime scene had produced a connection that pointed toward Stephen Crawford, the former Stanford campus security officer who had been linked to the university during the time of the murder, the man who had been close to the investigation from the beginning, the man who had lived for decades with the belief that the truth of that night would remain buried. But now, investigators were no longer asking if the case could be solved. They were asking how much of the truth had been hidden for all these years. The investigation entered its final and most intense stage. Detectives began preparing for the possibility that Crawford was not only connected to the evidence. They needed to determine whether he was the person responsible for the crime. Every decision mattered. Every action had consequences. After 4 decades, investigators could not afford mistakes. They needed a complete picture. The evidence, the timeline, the opportunity, the connection. Everything had to align. The first major question was simple. Where was Crawford on the night Arliss Perry was murdered? As a campus security officer, his presence at Stanford was not unusual. He had legitimate reasons to be on campus. He knew the area. He knew the buildings. He knew how the university operated after dark. That access made his connection to the crime scene significant. But access alone was not enough. Many people could have entered campus that night. Many people could have walked near the church. Investigators needed more. They needed the evidence to tell the story. And the DNA evidence provided the piece that had been missing since 1974. The case had always contained clues. But now those clues were connected by science. The same technology that had helped solve countless cold cases across America had finally reached Stanford. A crime that had remained untouched for decades was suddenly moving at extraordinary speed. Authorities began taking steps to confront Crawford. But the situation was unlike a typical investigation. This was not a young suspect trying to escape immediate arrest. This was a man who had lived almost an entire lifetime after crime. A man who had built decades of experiences beyond the shadow of the investigation. A man who, until this moment, had avoided public accountability. The question investigators faced was one of the most difficult in any cold case. How does someone carry a secret for 40 years? How does a person continue living normally while an unsolved murder remains behind them? Those questions created a disturbing reality. The passage of time had not erased the crime. It had only delayed the moment of discovery. For the Stanford community, the news was overwhelming. Many people who had followed the case for decades were shocked that the answer appeared to come from someone connected to the university itself. The location of the crime had always been one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. a respected institution, a peaceful campus, a place associated with knowledge and achievement. But behind that image was a tragedy that had remained unresolved for generations. The announcement reopened old memories. Former students remember the fear that followed the murder. They remembered the questions that surrounded the campus. They remembered wondering whether the person responsible was still nearby. And now, decades later, those questions were finally being answered. But the investigation was not only about identifying a suspect. It was about understanding the victim. Arliss Perry had become known to many people because of the crime that took her life. But investigators and those who knew her wanted the world to remember something more. She was not just a murder victim. She was a young woman with dreams, a daughter, a wife, a student, someone whose future had been stolen. The cold case investigation was not simply about closing a file. It was about restoring a story. The story of a life that ended too soon. As investigators prepared the final steps, the pressure increased. The evidence was decades old. The suspect was elderly. The world was watching. A case that had been one of America's most famous unsolved university murders was about to reach its conclusion. But then came another shocking development. Before authorities could take Crawford into custody and bring him before a court, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A turn that would leave the case with an ending almost as extraordinary as its beginning. Because after 40 years of searching for the person responsible, investigators discovered that the final confrontation would not happen in a courtroom. The man at the center of the investigation would never stand before a jury. The possibility of a public trial disappeared, and the world would be left with unanswered questions about the final moments of the man suspected of committing one of Stanford's darkest crimes. The events that followed stunned everyone watching the case. The investigation that had taken decades to reach a breakthrough suddenly moved toward an ending nobody expected. But before that final moment, investigators had already uncovered something powerful. The mystery that had haunted Stanford for generations was no longer a mystery. The evidence had revealed the person responsible. The silence of 40 years had finally been broken. And the small piece of DNA that waited inside the old evidence files had done what investigators once thought was impossible. It had reached across time. It had connected the past to the present. It had given Arliss Perry's story the answer it had been waiting for. But the final chapter of this extraordinary case would raise one last question. When the truth finally arrived after 4 decades of waiting, would it bring closure? Or would it create even more questions that could never be answered? Because sometimes solving a cold case does not end the mystery. Sometimes it reveals a deeper tragedy hidden beneath the surface. And in the case of Arliss Perry, the truth was finally coming out. But justice would arrive in a way nobody could have predicted. For 40 years, investigators chased a shadow, a name without an answer, a crime without a conclusion. The murder of Arliss Perry had become a case that seemed almost impossible to solve. But in the final years of the investigation, everything changed. A piece of evidence collected decades earlier had finally revealed what investigators had been searching for since 1974. The DNA had spoken, and the person connected to the murder was no longer just a possibility. He was a suspect. Stephen Crawford, the former Stanford campus security officer who had once walked the same grounds where Arliss Perry's life ended. The man whose name had existed around the investigation for decades. The man who had remained untouched while the case grew colder with every passing year. Now, after 4 decades of silence, authorities were preparing to confront him. The world watched as one of the longest-running mysteries in Stanford history approached its final moments. But the story of the investigation was not ending with a dramatic courtroom battle. Instead, it was moving toward an ending filled with uncertainty, unanswered emotions, and a final twist that shocked everyone. On June 28, 2018, investigators took action. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office moved forward with a plan to arrest Crawford. At the time, Crawford was 72 years old. He was no longer the young Stanford student security officer from 1974. He was an elderly man who had spent decades living a life far removed from the crime that followed him through history. For investigators, this was a moment when the past finally reached the present. The evidence had survived. The case had survived. And now, the suspect was facing the consequences of a crime that had remained unresolved for almost an entire lifetime. But before authorities could complete the arrest, the situation took an unexpected turn. Crawford died. According to authorities, he died by suicide shortly before investigators arrived to take him into custody. The man believed to be responsible for Arliss Perry's murder would never appear in court. He would never face a jury. He would never answer questions publicly. The possibility of a trial vanished instantly. And with it went the chance for many people to hear the full story in a courtroom. The announcement stunned those who had followed the case. After decades of waiting, after years of investigation, after the breakthrough that finally identified a suspect, the case ended without the traditional image of justice. No trial, no verdict, no final testimony, only evidence, and the knowledge that the person investigators believed responsible was gone. For Arliss Perry's family, the news carried complicated emotions. After 40 years of uncertainty, they finally had an answer. They knew who investigators believed killed Arliss. They knew the mystery that had haunted them had finally been solved. But there was also something missing. There would be no courtroom moment, no opportunity to confront Crawford, no public explanation, no chance to ask the questions that had remained unanswered since that terrible night in 1974. The truth had arrived, but it arrived differently than anyone expected. For investigators, however, the conclusion of the case was significant. The DNA evidence had accomplished what traditional investigation could not. It had identified the person connected to the crime scene. It had transformed a cold case into a solved investigation. The case demonstrated the extraordinary power of forensic science. A tiny biological clue preserved for decades had become the key to unlocking a mystery that had resisted countless interviews, theories, and searches. But even after the breakthrough, many questions remained. Questions that only Crawford could have answered. Why did he target Arliss? Why did the murder happen inside Stanford Memorial Church? What exactly happened during those final moments? Those answers disappeared with him. And that created a strange reality. The investigation was solved, but the story was incomplete. For decades, investigators have been searching for a name. They found that name, but they never received a confession. They never heard the explanation. They never learned the full motive. The silence that had surrounded the case for 40 years remained partly intact. Because sometimes the truth is discovered too late. Sometimes justice arrives after the opportunity for answers has already disappeared. The murder of Arliss Perry became a powerful example of both the success and limitations of cold case investigations. Science can identify. Evidence can connect. Technology can reveal hidden truths. But no machine can recreate a conversation with someone who is gone. No DNA test can explain a motive. No forensic breakthrough can replace the words of the person responsible. And that was the final tragedy surrounding the case. The world finally knew who investigators believed had killed Arliss Perry. But the world would never know everything. The story returned once again to Stanford Memorial Church, the location where a young woman's life ended, the place where a mystery began. For decades, people walked through that church without knowing the full history behind its walls. They saw architecture. They saw beauty. They saw a place of reflection. But behind that peaceful image was a crime that had haunted generations. A crime that had forced investigators to fight against time. a crime that had waited for science to catch up. And eventually, science did. The DNA evidence became the voice of a victim who could no longer speak. It told investigators where to look. It pointed toward the person responsible. It gave Arliss Perry something that had been missing for decades: recognition. Her murder would no longer remain an anonymous mystery. Her name would no longer exist only inside an unsolved case file. She would be remembered as a young woman whose story changed the way people understand cold case investigations. Because the lesson of Arliss Perry's murder was larger than one crime. It showed that evidence can survive. That time does not always protect criminals. That even the smallest trace can remain powerful decades later. The person responsible may disappear. Witnesses may forget. Memories may fade. But evidence can wait. And in this case, it waited for 40 years. The investigation that began with shock and fear ended with a scientific breakthrough that reached across generations. A single DNA sample overturned decades of uncertainty. A frozen case moved again. A forgotten clue became the center of the investigation. And the question that had haunted Stanford since 1974 finally had an answer. Who killed Arliss Perry? After 4 decades, investigators finally knew. But the final moments of the case left behind a different kind of mystery. Because the truth had been found. But the full story had vanished forever. The murder of Arliss Perry was finally no longer an unsolved mystery. After nearly 4 decades of uncertainty, investigators had reached a conclusion that generations before them had been unable to achieve. The evidence had identified the person they believed responsible. The DNA had broken through years of silence. The case that had once seemed destined to remain forever open had finally moved toward closure. But closure did not come the way anyone imagined. There was no dramatic courtroom trial. No jury listening to every detail. No final testimony from the person accused. Instead, the case ended with a strange combination of answers and emptiness. The world knew who investigators believed had committed the crime, but the world would never hear the full explanation. And that created one of the most haunting aspects of the Arliss Perry investigation. The mystery was solved, but the darkness surrounding that night remained. For decades, investigators had tried to understand what happened inside Stanford Memorial Church. They had studied the evidence. They had examined the crime scene. They had followed leads that disappeared. They had interviewed people whose memories were incomplete. But the final truth came from something much smaller than expected. A trace. A microscopic piece of evidence left behind in 1974. Something invisible. Something forgotten. Something that waited patiently while the world changed around it. The DNA evidence became the turning point. It transformed a case that had depended on memories into a case supported by science. And that transformation represented one of the biggest changes in modern criminal investigation. In 1974, detectives had to rely heavily on traditional methods. Witness accounts, physical observations, paper records, interviews. But decades later, forensic technology had become powerful enough to revisit old evidence and discover information that investigators in the past could never access. The Arliss Perry case became a dramatic example of how time can work in 2 opposite ways. Time can help criminals hide, but time can also help investigators find them. The person responsible had lived for decades believing the crime belonged only to the past. But the past was not finished. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. And eventually, the truth emerged. Yet for many people connected to the case, the discovery brought complicated emotions. For Arliss Perry's loved ones, there was relief. After 40 years of questions, they finally had an answer. The person responsible was no longer unknown. The case was no longer an endless search. The name of the killer, was no longer a mystery. But there was also a painful reality. The answer came too late to provide everything they wanted. There would be no trial, no public examination of the evidence, no opportunity to hear the suspect explain his actions, no moment where every unanswered question could be placed before a judge and jury. The truth had arrived, but only partially. And that is one of the cruelest realities of cold cases. Sometimes solving the crime does not mean recovering everything that was lost. Sometimes the evidence arrives after the opportunity for complete justice has disappeared. The story of Arliss Perry became a reminder that victims are not just cases. They are people whose lives existed before tragedy. Arliss was 19 years old. She was a student. She was newly married. She had plans. She had dreams. She had a future that should have continued. But instead, her name became connected forever to one of the most shocking crimes in Stanford's history. The investigation that followed changed the lives of everyone involved. The detectives who worked the case carried the weight of mystery they could not solve. The community carried the fear of knowing a killer had walked among them. And the family carried the pain of waiting for answers. For years, they lived with uncertainty. Every anniversary brought memories. Every unanswered question reopened the wound. Every new cold case breakthrough around the country created the possibility that maybe one day Arliss's case would finally move forward. That day eventually came. But the road to that moment was long and filled with obstacles. The investigation had survived because people refused to let it disappear. Cold cases often depend on persistence. A detective who refuses to ignore an old file. A family member who continues asking questions. A forensic expert who believes a forgotten piece of evidence still matters. Without that persistence, many cases remain buried forever. The Arliss Perry investigation showed why old evidence matters. Why evidence preservation matters. Why every detail collected at a crime scene can have value beyond its original moment. Because nobody in 1974 could have predicted what DNA technology would become. Nobody knew that a sample collected during a murder investigation could one day identify a suspect 4 decades later. The investigators of that era were working with the tools they had. They documented. They preserved. They collected. And those actions eventually gave future investigators the opportunity to solve the case. The story also raised a disturbing question that followed the investigation from the beginning. How could someone commit such a crime and remain undiscovered for so long? How could a person connected to a major murder investigation continue living a normal life while the victim's family waited for answers? Those questions are difficult because they reveal one of the most unsettling aspects of criminal cases. The passage of time can create distance between an action and its consequences. A person can move forward. A community can change. A world can forget. But for victims and their families, time does not erase what happened. The pain remains connected to the moment everything changed. For Arliss Perry's family, the date October 12, 1974, would always represent the moment their lives were divided into 2 parts. Before and after. The case also left a lasting impact on Stanford University. The murder became part of the institution's history, a reminder that even places associated with achievement, knowledge, and safety are not immune from tragedy. The university continued. Students continued studying. Research continued. New generations arrived. But the memory of Arliss remained. Her story became attached to the halls of Stanford Memorial Church forever, a reminder of the importance of remembering victims beyond the crime itself. Because every headline eventually disappears. Every investigation eventually reaches a conclusion. But the person at the center of the story remains. Arliss Perry was not defined by how she died. She was defined by who she was. A young woman whose life was interrupted. A person whose story survived because people refused to stop searching for the truth. The investigation may have ended. The evidence may have provided an answer, but the emotional impact of the case remained. Because some crimes leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind questions about time, about justice, about memory, about how a single moment can change countless lives forever. And even after the final breakthrough, one image remained impossible to forget. A quiet church on a night in October. A young woman entering a place where she believed she would be safe. A crime that shocked the university. A mystery that lasted 40 years. And a tiny piece of evidence that waited silently until science was ready. The killer had escaped the reach of investigators for decades. But the truth had never truly disappeared. It was waiting inside the evidence, waiting inside the investigation, waiting for the moment when the past would finally return. And when it did, it changed everything. For decades, the name Arliss Perry represented a question without an answer, a face attached to a mystery, a young woman whose life ended inside a place that was supposed to represent peace, a murder that remained untouched by time, even as the world around it changed. But after the discovery of DNA evidence and the identification of Stephen Crawford as the person investigators believed responsible, the case entered a different stage. The search was over. The investigation had reached its destination. But the story of what happened inside Stanford Memorial Church continued to haunt everyone who had followed it. Because some cases are remembered not only because of how they are solved. They are remembered because of what they reveal about justice, time, and the limits of human understanding. The murder of Arliss Perry became one of those cases. A crime that demonstrated the incredible power of modern science. A crime that showed how evidence can survive for generations. But also a crime that reminded people that even when answers finally arrive, they do not always arrive in the form people expect. When investigators announced a breakthrough, the reaction was immediate. For many, it was difficult to believe that a case nearly 40 years old had finally been solved. A mystery that had existed since the 1970s was suddenly no longer just a story from old newspapers. It was real again. The headlines returned. The memories returned. The questions that had remained unanswered for decades were suddenly being discussed once more. People who had forgotten the details of the case began searching for information. Former students remembered the fear that once spread across the Stanford campus. Investigators who had worked the case remembered the years of uncertainty. And Arliss Perry's family once again found themselves facing the painful reality of tragedy that had defined so much of their lives. The breakthrough brought confirmation. But confirmation is not the same as healing. A solved case cannot reverse time. It cannot restore a lost life. It cannot erase the years of waiting. It cannot remove the pain of a family that spent decades wondering if the truth would ever come. For the people who loved Arliss, the investigation was never simply about finding a suspect. It was about honoring her memory. It was about making sure her story did not disappear into an old file. And that was one of the reasons the case remained important. Because behind every cold case is a person. Not just evidence. Not just reports. Not just headlines. A human life. Arliss Perry was a teenager when she arrived at Stanford. She was beginning adulthood. She was building relationships. She was creating plans for a future she would never see. Her death transformed her from a young woman with dreams into a symbol of an unanswered question. But the investigation eventually allowed another part of her story to return. The story of who she was before the crime. The story of a person whose life mattered beyond the tragedy. The case also became a lesson in the importance of preserving evidence. In 1974, investigators could not know what technology would become. They could not imagine that decades later, forensic science would develop the ability to examine microscopic evidence in ways that were once impossible. They could not know that a clue collected during the original investigation would eventually become the most important piece of the entire case. But they preserved it. And because they preserved it, future investigators had a chance. That chance became the breakthrough. The investigation showed that cold cases are not always dead cases. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the right moment, waiting for new technology, waiting for new investigators, waiting for a new perspective. Across America, thousands of unsolved crimes have remained open for years or decades. Many families continue waiting. Many victims continue waiting for their stories to be completed. The Arliss Perry case became a powerful example of why those investigations matter. Because one day, the smallest piece of evidence may become the piece that changes everything. But even after the scientific breakthrough, the case continued to raise difficult questions. Questions about motive. Questions about the events inside the church. Questions that investigators could no longer ask the only person who could provide direct answers. Stephen Crawford's death meant that the courtroom would never reveal the full details. There would be no testimony, no cross-examination, no public explanation. The evidence pointed toward a conclusion, but the complete story remained partly hidden. And that created a unique ending. A solved mystery with missing pages. A case with an answer, but without every detail. For some investigators, that reality is one of the hardest parts of cold case work. Finding the person responsible is one challenge. Understanding every reason behind the crime is another. Sometimes the evidence tells you who, but it cannot always tell you why. The murder of Arliss Perry remained a powerful example of that reality. The DNA provided the connection. The investigation provided the history. But the motive remained locked away. The passage of time had solved one mystery while creating another. What exactly happened during those final moments inside Stanford Memorial Church? What thoughts were going through the mind of the person responsible? Why was Arliss chosen? Why did the crime happen in that location? Those questions became part of the permanent mystery surrounding the case. Not because investigators failed, but because time had taken away the one person who could answer them. Still, the conclusion of the investigation brought something that had been missing since 1974. Recognition. The world finally acknowledged that Arliss Perry's death was not just an unsolved tragedy. It was a crime with a responsible person. A crime with evidence. A crime with an answer. And for the investigators who worked the case, that mattered. Because every cold case carries the same mission. To speak for someone who can no longer speak. To search for truth when time has created obstacles. To prove that victims are not forgotten. The Arliss Perry investigation lasted longer than many careers. Detectives changed. Technology changed. The world changed. But the goal remained the same. Find the truth. And eventually, the truth was found. The story that began with fear ended with science. The mystery that began in darkness ended with evidence. The question that remained unanswered for 40 years finally received its answer. But the case continued to live on because of the questions that remained. Because some stories do not disappear after they are solved. They become reminders. Reminders that justice can take years. Reminders that evidence can survive. Reminders that time does not always protect those who commit crimes. And reminders that behind every investigation is someone whose life was taken away. On the campus of Stanford University, the memory of Arliss Perry remains connected to a single place. A church. A quiet building. A location that became the center of one of the most unforgettable criminal investigations in American history. Decades later, the walls still stand. The campus still moves forward. New students continue walking through the same university grounds. But the story remains. A story of a young woman. A terrible crime. A forgotten clue. and a DNA sample that waited 40 years to reveal the truth. Because in the end, the most powerful message from the Arliss Perry case was simple. The past does not always stay buried. Sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest piece of evidence can bring an entire mystery back to life. For nearly half a century, the story of Arliss Perry existed as one of the most haunting chapters in Stanford University's history. A young woman, a quiet church, a devastating crime, and a question that refused to disappear. Who was responsible? For 40 years, that question followed investigators, haunted the community, and remained a source of unimaginable pain for Arliss Perry's family. But when DNA technology finally unlocked the answer, the case became something more than a murder investigation. It became a lesson in how time, science, and persistence can change the fate of a cold case. The murder of Arliss Perry proved that even when a case appears forgotten, the evidence may still be waiting. It proved that a crime scene does not lose its voice simply because decades pass. And it proved that justice can move slowly, but it can still arrive. The discovery that connected Stephen Crawford to crime changed the entire history of the investigation. For decades, detectives had searched through possibilities. They had examined theories. They had followed leads that went nowhere. They had faced the frustration of knowing that a young woman had been murdered, yet the person responsible remained beyond reach. But the DNA evidence created a turning point. The mystery that had survived generations was finally reduced to a name. The investigation that began with uncertainty now had a direction. The question was no longer, who could have done this? The question became, how did this remain hidden for so long? That question was one of the most disturbing parts of the case, because the investigation suggested something deeply unsettling. The person connected to crime had not vanished into a completely unknown identity. He had lived a life. He had moved through the world. He had existed in the same society that continued searching for answers. The passage of time had allowed the case to grow colder, but had also allowed the evidence to grow stronger. The same decades that created distance between the crime and the investigation also created the technology capable of solving it. That contradiction became the defining element of the case. Time was both the enemy and the solution. The original investigators in 1974 worked with the tools available to them. They documented the scene. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They followed every lead they could find. But some answers were beyond the reach of the science of that era. DNA analysis would not become the powerful investigative tool it is today until years later. The investigators could preserve evidence, but they could not unlock all of its secrets. That would require another generation, another era, another level of forensic science. And eventually, that era arrived. The advancement of DNA testing changed criminal investigations around the world. Old evidence could be re-examined. Unknown samples could be compared. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly began moving again. The Arliss Perry investigation became part of that transformation. A case once considered trapped in history was pulled into the present. The evidence that had remained silent for 40 years finally produced a voice. But the emotional impact of the breakthrough was complicated. For many people, the identification of a suspect brought relief. For others, it brought a new wave of sadness, because every answer also reopened the memory of what had happened. Every news report reminded people that a young woman had lost her life. Every discussion of the investigation returned to the moment when a family was changed forever. The case was solved, but the tragedy remained. That is the difficult reality of homicide investigations. Solving a crime can provide answers, but it cannot undo the crime itself. It cannot return the person who was lost. It cannot restore the years taken away. It can only provide the truth. And sometimes truth is the only thing left that can be given. The legacy of the Arliss Perry case extended beyond the investigation itself. It became an example of why cold cases continue to matter. Because every unsolved case represents someone waiting. Someone who deserves to be remembered. Someone whose story deserves to reach a conclusion. The case also showed the importance of evidence preservation. Without the decisions made in 1974, the breakthrough decades later may never have happened. A piece of evidence that seemed ordinary at the time became the foundation of the final investigation. That reality changed how many people viewed old cases. Evidence is not limited by time. A clue does not become meaningless simply because years pass. Sometimes, the smallest detail becomes the most important one. The murder of Arliss Perry also left a permanent mark on the Stanford community. For students and staff who knew the history, the case represented a moment when a place associated with safety and achievement was suddenly connected to fear. The campus recovered. Life continued. But the memory remained. Because certain events become part of a place's identity. Certain moments cannot be erased. Stanford Memorial Church remained a beautiful and historic building. But it also carried the memory of a tragedy that had shaped generations of people. The story of Arliss Perry continued because people remembered. They remembered the young woman. They remembered the investigation. They remembered the unanswered questions. And they remembered the importance of finding the truth. The conclusion of the case also raised broader questions about justice. What does justice mean after 40 years? Is it an arrest? A conviction? A confession? A courtroom verdict? Or is it simply knowing the truth? For many families of victims, justice has many meanings. Sometimes it is hearing the name of the person responsible. Sometimes it is knowing that the victim has not been forgotten. Sometimes it is finally being able to say that the case is no longer open. In the case of Arliss Perry, the truth came after an extraordinary wait. The investigation lasted longer than many people expected. But the search never completely ended. And when the answer finally arrived, it proved something investigators had always believed. A cold case is never truly silent. The evidence may wait. The files may sit untouched. The world may move on. But the truth can remain hidden until the right moment. And when that moment comes, everything can change. The story of Arliss Perry's murder was no longer only about a crime from 1974. It became a story about perseverance, about science, about the power of evidence, about the importance of remembering victims. A single DNA sample had reached across 4 decades and transformed the investigation. A tiny piece of information had done what countless interviews and theories could not. It had revealed the person investigators believed was responsible. But even with that answer, one final emotion remained. A feeling shared by many who followed the case from the beginning. A feeling that the truth had finally arrived. But far too late. Because every year that passed represented another year without answers. Another anniversary without justice. Another reminder that some families spend their entire lives waiting for a moment that may never come. For Arliss Perry's loved ones, that moment eventually arrived. Not in a courtroom, not through a confession, but through science, through evidence, through a discovery that proved the past was never truly gone. The mystery had survived for 40 years, but the truth survived longer. For 40 years, the name Arliss Perry remained connected to one haunting question. A question that began inside Stanford Memorial Church on a cold October night in 1974. Who killed her? For decades, there was no answer. Only memories. Only evidence stored away in old files. Only a family waiting for the truth. The world changed around the case. Technology advanced. Generations came and went. The Stanford campus continued growing. But the mystery remained frozen in time. until one piece of evidence finally broke the silence. A DNA sample, a trace invisible to the human eye, a clue that had waited nearly 4 decades for science to become powerful enough to understand it. That single discovery transformed everything. The case that investigators once feared might never be solved was suddenly moving toward its conclusion. The past had returned, and it brought with it an answer. The investigation into Arliss Perry's murder became one of the clearest examples of how modern forensic science can change history. A crime committed in an era before DNA testing became a major investigative tool was eventually solved because of that same technology. The evidence that once seemed limited became the key. The clue that once had no voice finally spoke. And after decades of uncertainty, investigators identified Stephen Crawford as the person they believe responsible for Arliss Perry's death. A man who had been connected to Stanford. A man who had been part of the campus environment. A man whose name had existed near the investigation from the beginning. The revelation shocked many people, not only because of the age of the case, not only because of the decades that had passed, but because of the realization that the answer had been connected to the same place where the tragedy occurred. The murder of Arliss Perry was never just a story about a crime. It was a story about unanswered questions, about a family forced to live with uncertainty, about investigators fighting against time, about a community trying to understand how something so horrific could happen in a place that represented knowledge, safety, and hope. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story about a victim whose life deserved to be remembered. Before she became the center of one of America's most famous cold cases, Arliss Perry was a young woman with an entire future ahead of her. She was a student, a wife, a daughter, a person with dreams that had nothing to do with crime or tragedy. Her life was much larger than the circumstances of her death. But for decades, the world knew her name because of what happened to her. The investigation helped restore another part of her story, the story of who she was, the story of a life that existed before the headlines. The case also became a reminder that justice does not always follow the timeline people expect. Some investigations are solved quickly. Some take years. Some take decades. And some require technology that does not yet exist when the crime occurs. The murder of Arliss Perry belonged to that final category. In 1974, investigators did what they could with the tools available. They collected evidence. They documented the scene. They searched for answers. But the final piece of the puzzle was beyond their reach. Only later could science reveal what had been hidden. That is why cold cases remain important. Because time does not erase evidence. It does not erase victims. It does not erase the responsibility to search for the truth. The Arliss Perry investigation showed that an old case is not necessarily a forgotten case. Sometimes it is simply waiting. Waiting for new technology. Waiting for new investigators. Waiting for the moment when one discovery changes everything. But even after the breakthrough, the case carried a painful reality. The person investigators believed responsible would never face a public trial. There would be no courtroom where every detail was examined. No moment when every question could be asked. No confession explaining what happened during those final moments inside the church. The evidence provided an answer, but it could not provide every explanation. And that became the final mystery surrounding the case. The world knew who investigators believed killed Arliss Perry, but the world would never know every reason why. That absence created a lasting sense of unfinished emotion, because solving a murder is about more than identifying a person. It is also about understanding the motive, understanding the choices, understanding the events that led to the tragedy. Those answers disappeared with time. But what remained was something powerful. The truth that Arliss Perry's story had not been forgotten. The truth that investigators continued searching. The truth that evidence collected decades earlier still mattered. The truth that justice can survive even when it takes a lifetime to arrive. The story of Arliss Perry's murder continues to resonate because it represents both the tragedy of a life lost and the possibility of answers found. It represents the pain of waiting, but also the power of persistence. It represents the darkness of a crime committed in a place of peace, but also the light created when the truth finally emerges. The halls of Stanford Memorial Church still stand. The campus continues moving forward. Students continue arriving with hopes and dreams of their own. Most will never know the full history behind those walls, but the memory remains. A young woman entered that church one night. A crime changed an entire community. A mystery lasted for 40 years. And a tiny piece of evidence eventually revealed what happened. The case that once seemed impossible became a reminder of something investigators around the world continue to believe. No matter how much time passes, the truth can remain. No matter how old a case becomes, evidence can still matter. No matter how long a family waits, the search for justice still has meaning. Because the passage of time does not erase the importance of a victim. It does not reduce the value of a life. It does not make unanswered questions disappear. The murder of Arliss Perry began as a nightmare. A shocking crime that left a university searching for answers. It became a decades-long mystery. A cold case that seemed destined to remain unresolved. But in the end, it became something else. A story of science overcoming time. A story of evidence overcoming silence. A story of forgotten clue that changed everything. 40 years after Arliss Perry's death, the investigation finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The question that had haunted investigators. The question that had haunted the Stanford community. The question that had haunted a family for decades. Finally had an answer. Who killed Arliss Perry? The truth was uncovered. The mystery was broken. The silence ended. But the memory remained. Because behind every cold case is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a life. Behind every headline is a story that deserves to be remembered. And the story of Arliss Perry will always remain one of the most haunting reminders that even after decades of darkness, the truth can still find its way back into the light. There are cases that disappear with time. Cases that become forgotten headlines. Cases that remain only as names inside old records. But the murder of Arliss Perry was different. It refused to disappear. For decades, the story survived because one question remained impossible to ignore. How could a young woman walk into a place of peace and never walk out alive? How could a crime so shocking happen in the middle of a respected university? How could the person responsible remain unidentified for so long? Those questions followed the case from 1974 until the day science finally uncovered the truth. But even after the breakthrough, the story of Arliss Perry continued. Because some crimes are not remembered only because of how they end. They are remembered because of the impact they leave behind. The murder changed Stanford. It changed the way people viewed safety. It changed the way investigators approached old cases. And it became a reminder that every piece of evidence has a story waiting to be told. For years, the evidence from the crime scene sat quietly. A small piece of the past preserved inside an investigation file. At the time, nobody knew how important it would become. Nobody knew that technology would eventually catch up with a crime committed decades earlier. Nobody knew that a single DNA sample would one day transform the entire case. But that is the unpredictable nature of forensic science. A clue that appears ordinary today may become the key to tomorrow's greatest breakthrough. The Arliss Perry case became proof that justice does not always follow the timeline people expect. Sometimes justice arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes years. And sometimes it takes an entire generation. The investigation survived because people refused to let the story disappear. Detectives continued looking. Families continued waiting. Researchers continued improving the science. Every person who played a role in preserving the evidence contributed to the possibility that the truth would eventually emerge. Without that persistence, the case might have remained forever trapped in the past. But the truth had been waiting. And when it finally arrived, it changed everything. The story of Arliss Perry's murder also revealed one of the most difficult realities of criminal investigations. Finding the answer does not always remove the pain. For those who loved Arliss, the conclusion of the case brought relief. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally a name connected to the crime. There was finally recognition that her death had not been forgotten. But no investigation can return what was taken away. No arrest can restore the years lost. No scientific discovery can erase the moment when a family's life changed forever. The truth can provide closure. But closure does not mean forgetting. It means finally understanding. It means knowing that the questions that haunted the past have finally been answered. For Stanford University, the case became a permanent part of its history. The campus continued to represent innovation, education, and discovery. But behind that reputation was also a reminder of vulnerability. A reminder that tragedy can happen anywhere, even in places people believe are protected, even in places associated with knowledge and progress. The murder inside Stanford Memorial Church became a symbol of that contradiction. A place built for reflection became the scene of a crime that shocked an entire nation. A place associated with peace became connected forever to a story of violence. And yet, decades later, the same story also became connected to something else. Hope. The hope that evidence can survive. The hope that technology can reveal hidden truths. The hope that families waiting for answers may one day receive them. Across the world, cold cases continue to challenge investigators. Thousands of families continue waiting. Thousands of victims remain without justice. But the Arliss Perry case became a reminder that time does not always belong to the person who commits the crime. Sometimes, time belongs to the truth, because every year that passes brings new technology, new methods, new opportunities. A criminal may believe that time creates safety, but time can also create a path back to the evidence. The person responsible for Arliss Perry's death could not have predicted what science would become. They could not have known that decades later, investigators with tools powerful enough to revisit the past. They could not have known that a tiny biological trace could survive longer than their secrets. And that may be the most powerful message from the case. The smallest details matter. The forgotten evidence matters. The victims matter. The search matters. Because every investigation begins with the same promise. That someone will look. That someone will remember. That someone will continue searching until the truth is found. The murder of Arliss Perry began as a tragedy. A crime that left a family devastated. A university shaken. A community searching for answers. But over time, it became something larger. It became a story about the power of evidence, the importance of perseverance, and the possibility that even the oldest mysteries can still be solved. 40 years separated the crime from the breakthrough. 40 years between the night Arliss Perry entered Stanford Memorial Church and the moment science revealed what investigators had been searching for. 40 years of silence. Then one discovery changed everything. A DNA sample. A hidden message from the past. A final piece of evidence that refused to disappear. The case may have ended differently than many expected. There was no traditional courtroom conclusion. No public trial. No final explanation from the person investigators believed responsible. But the truth was still uncovered. The mystery was still answered. And Arliss Perry's name was no longer attached to an unsolved case. She was remembered. her story was heard. Her life mattered. And perhaps that is the most important ending a cold case can have. Not simply finding a suspect, not simply closing a file, but making sure the victim is never forgotten. Today, the story of Arliss Perry remains one of the most remarkable examples of how modern forensic science can reach across decades and uncover the truth. It stands as a warning to those who believe time will erase their actions, and it stands as a message of hope for those still waiting for answers. Because evidence remembers. Science remembers. And sometimes, after years of silence, the truth returns. Not with a warning, not with a sound, but quietly, hidden inside a single piece of evidence, waiting for the moment when the world is finally ready to listen. The story began with a young woman entering a church. It ended with a mystery finally being solved. But the memory of Arliss Perry remains. A reminder that behind every cold case is a person. Behind every investigation is a family. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. And behind every unanswered question, there may still be an answer waiting to be found. For most crimes, the final moment comes with an arrest, a courtroom, a verdict, a sentence, a public declaration that justice has been served. But the murder of Arliss Perry ended differently. It ended with a discovery, a revelation, a truth that arrived after 4 decades of silence. And yet, it also ended with something missing. The answers that only one person could provide. The explanation that would never be heard. The final words that disappeared forever. That was the strange and painful reality of the case. The investigation had succeeded, but the story was incomplete. Because sometimes the truth is found before the entire story can be recovered. The DNA evidence solved the central mystery. It connected the crime scene from 1974 to a person investigators believed responsible. It transformed a case that had remained frozen for decades. But it could not recreate the past. It could not reveal every thought, every decision, every moment that led to the tragedy inside Stanford Memorial Church. And that left behind one of the most haunting questions surrounding the case. After 40 years of searching, what happens when the answer finally arrives, but the person who knows the full truth is gone? For investigators, the conclusion of the Arliss Perry case represented both achievement and frustration. They had accomplished what many thought was impossible. They had solved a decades-old murder. They had shown that cold cases can still move forward. They had demonstrated that evidence collected generations earlier can become powerful when combined with modern technology. But investigators also understood what had been lost. A trial would never happen. A jury would never hear the complete timeline. The public would never hear a confession. The person at the center of the investigation would never explain what happened that night. The evidence could identify, but it could not speak for him. That silence became part of the legacy of the case. Because murder investigations are not only about identifying responsibility. They are about understanding the human decisions behind a crime. The motive, the planning, the reason a person chooses to destroy another life. Those answers often become the final piece of closure. But in the Arliss Perry case, that final piece remained hidden. And perhaps that is why the case continues to fascinate people decades later. It contains both resolution and mystery. It has an answer, but it also has shadows. It has a conclusion, but it also has unanswered questions. The story reflects one of the most complicated realities of criminal justice. Truth and closure are not always the same thing. The truth may finally be discovered. But closure depends on much more. It depends on time, on acceptance, on understanding, on the ability to move forward after something unimaginable has happened. For Arliss Perry's family, the journey lasted almost an entire lifetime. They lived through years of uncertainty, years of wondering, years of anniversaries marked by the same painful question. Would anyone ever know what happened? Would anyone ever be held responsible? Would Arliss ever receive justice? For decades, the answer remained uncertain. But eventually, the world learned what investigators believe happened. Her story moved from a cold case file into history. The name Arliss Perry became connected not only to tragedy, but also to perseverance. Her case became an example of how victims can still find justice, even after extraordinary amounts of time have passed. It became a message to families around the world who continue waiting. A message that an unsolved case is not always a forgotten case. A message that evidence can survive. A message that time does not guarantee escape. The investigation also highlighted the changing nature of criminal science. In 1974, detectives relied on the tools available to them. They worked through interviews. They examined physical evidence. They searched for patterns. But the technology required to reveal the full truth had not yet been developed. Decades later, a new generation of investigators returned to the same evidence with completely different capabilities. The crime scene had not changed. The evidence had not changed. But the ability to understand it had changed forever. That transformation is one of the most powerful aspects of modern forensic science. It allows the past to communicate with the present. It allows old cases to breathe again. It allows investigators to revisit moments that seemed permanently lost. The Arliss Perry case became a perfect example of that connection between generations. The investigators of 1974 collected the evidence. The investigators of the future unlocked its meaning. Together, separated by decades, they completed the same mission. Find the truth. Remember the victim. Seek justice. The story also left behind a warning that crimes do not disappear simply because years pass. A person may believe that time creates distance, that memories fade, that attention disappears. But evidence can remain, and science can evolve. The same years that separate a crime from its investigation can also create the tools needed to solve it. The person responsible for Arliss Perry's death lived through an era of enormous change. Technology transformed. Society transformed. The world transformed. But one thing remained constant: the evidence. The evidence carried the connection between the past and the present. It waited until investigators had the ability to understand what it meant. And when they did, the entire case changed. The murder that had once represented failure became a story of discovery. The unanswered question became an answered question. The forgotten file became a headline again. And the smallest trace became the most important voice in the investigation. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Arliss Perry case is not about the suspect. It is about the victim. Because every cold case eventually comes back to one person. The person whose life was taken. The person whose story deserves to be told. The person who cannot speak for themselves. Arliss Perry was 19 years old when her life ended. She never had the chance to grow older. She never had the chance to experience the future she imagined. She never had the chance to see what her life could have become. But decades later, her story still reached people. Not because of the violence that ended her life, but because people continued searching for the truth. Her name survived. Her story survived. And eventually, justice found its way back to her. The case that began with fear ended with science. The mystery that began in darkness ended with evidence. The silence that lasted 40 years was finally broken. But the echoes remained. Because some crimes do not end when the investigation ends. They continue through memory, through history, through the lessons they leave behind. The murder of Arliss Perry remains a reminder that every victim matters. Every piece of evidence matters. Every unanswered question matters. And even after decades pass, the truth can still return. Sometimes it arrives through a witness, sometimes through a confession, and sometimes it arrives through a single piece of DNA that waited 40 years to tell the world what happened. Some mysteries fade because people stop asking questions. Others survive because the questions are too important to ignore. The murder of Arliss Perry belonged to the second category. Decades after that October night in 1974, the case continued living in the memories of those who refused to forget. It remained inside old investigation files, inside archive photographs, inside the minds of detectives who had spent years trying to understand what happened, and inside the hearts of a family that had spent a lifetime waiting for answers. The discovery of DNA evidence changed the direction of the case. It transformed a mystery into a conclusion. But the impact of the investigation went far beyond identifying the person investigators believed responsible. The case became a symbol of how far forensic science had advanced, a symbol of how powerful persistence could be, and a symbol of the fact that even the oldest crimes can still carry evidence capable of revealing the truth. When Arliss Perry was murdered, nobody could imagine what the future would bring. The world of criminal investigation was completely different. There were no massive DNA databases. There was no modern forensic technology capable of analyzing microscopic traces with incredible precision. Investigators had to rely on observation, experience, human memory, traditional detective work. They worked with what they had. And what they had was enough to preserve the possibility of justice. That decision mattered, because decades later, the evidence collected during that original investigation became the foundation of the breakthrough. The past and the present connected. The detectives of one generation unknowingly created the opportunity for another generation to solve the case. That is one of the most remarkable aspects of cold case investigations. They are not solved by one moment alone. They are solved by years of effort, by people who continue searching even when answers seem impossible, by investigators who refuse to accept that an unsolved case means an unsolvable case. The Arliss Perry investigation proved that patience can become a weapon against time, because time had not erased the truth. It had only delayed its discovery. For years, the murder remained a painful reminder of uncertainty. The Stanford community remembered the fear that followed the crime. Students and staff wonder how such an event could happen in a place associated with education and safety. Parents question whether their children were truly protected. The university continued functioning, but the memory of the tragedy remained. Because certain crimes become permanently connected to the places where they happen. Stanford Memorial Church was not simply a building. It became a location with a history. A place where people remembered both beauty and tragedy. A place where one night changed everything. But over time, the story also became about something else. The power of remembrance. Because remembering a victim is one of the most important parts of justice. Long after investigations end and headlines disappear, memory remains. And memory ensures that victims are not reduced to a case number. Arliss Perry was not just a name in a police report. She was a person who had a childhood, a family, dreams, a future that should have continued. Her story mattered before the crime, and it mattered after. The investigation simply gave the world a way to remember her. The case also raised important questions about the nature of justice after decades have passed. Can justice truly arrive after 40 years? Can anything repair the damage caused by such a loss? Can an answer erase decades of uncertainty? The reality is complicated. Justice cannot reverse time. It cannot restore the years that were taken away. It cannot bring back the moments that Arliss never experienced. But justice can provide something powerful. Truth. The knowledge that a victim was not forgotten. The knowledge that the search continued. the knowledge that the person responsible was identified. For many families of homicide victims, that truth becomes an essential part of healing. The Arliss Perry case also demonstrated a frightening reality about criminal investigations. Sometimes the person responsible is not caught because they are invisible. Sometimes they remain free because the tools needed to identify them do not yet exist. A person can believe they have escaped consequences. They can believe time has erased the evidence. They can believe the world has moved on. But evidence has a different timeline. A fingerprint, a biological sample, a forgotten object, a small detail. Any of these can remain silent for years before suddenly becoming the key to solving a mystery. The evidence from the Arliss Perry case waded through decades of change. It waded through different generations of investigators. It waded through a changing world. And eventually, it delivered the answer. That reality continues to influence how law enforcement handles unsolved cases today. Old evidence is preserved. New technology is applied. Cases once considered impossible are reopened. Because every investigator knows the same thing. The future may hold the tool needed to solve yesterday's crime. The murder of Arliss Perry became one of those examples. A case that appeared trapped in the past suddenly became a modern forensic breakthrough. A mystery from the 1970s became a lesson for the future. But even with all the scientific achievements, one emotional truth remained. The case was never only about solving crime. It was about remembering a person whose life ended before she had the chance to experience everything that was waiting ahead. That is why the story continued to matter. Because behind every cold case is a human story. Behind every investigation file is someone who was loved. Behind every piece of evidence is a moment connected to a real life. The murder of Arliss Perry began as a tragedy that shocked a university. It became a mystery that lasted for decades. It became a forensic breakthrough that changed everything. But ultimately, it became a reminder that the search for truth has value. Even when the years seem impossible, even when memories fade, even when the world moves forward, the past can still return. The truth can still emerge. And justice can still find a way. 40 years after Arliss Perry's death, a single DNA sample changed the entire investigation. It crossed generations. It crossed decades. It connected a crime scene from the past with the technology of the present. And it proved something investigators have always believed. A case is never truly silent. Not while evidence remains. Not while people continue searching. Not while someone still remembers the victim. Because sometimes the smallest clue carries the largest story. Sometimes the quietest evidence creates the loudest answer. And sometimes, after 40 years of waiting, the truth finally speaks.